Good afternoon, everyone. It is August 13th, 2018, and this is the Administrative Committee meeting of the Moscow City Council. I'm Gina Terusio. To my right is Art Bedke, and to my left, Ann Zabala. We will jump into our agenda. The first item is the approval of the Administrative Committee July 23rd, 2018 minutes.
Looked good to me.
Looked good? Okay, they're approved. Second item is 3rd Street Interpretive Sign Project. Mike Ray. Good afternoon, Mike. How are you?
Doing well. How about you?
Good. Did you have to think about that a little bit?
Well, my presentation was not where I left it. So.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
So, before you today, we have a project that the Historic Preservation Commission has been working on pretty much over the last year and a half. You may recall that a number of years ago, they had worked to install bronze plaques in the downtown historic district. So these were the oval bronze plaques that gave a little bit of information about the first use of the building and when the building was established. And these were for all the buildings downtown that are contributing to the downtown historic district. So there are a number of buildings that are contributing, some that are non-contributing. All the ones that are contributing are on the National Register of Historic Places within that district. And so they'd worked for a number of years at getting these bronze plaques installed on all the contributing buildings. And so if you walk downtown, along with the directional signs that Public Works had installed a couple years ago, you'll see these plaques on the buildings which identify these things. And so really the next step that they had envisioned was to go up the 3rd Street corridor. We have kind of all these key institutional buildings like City Hall, Carnegie Library, 1912 Center, and the Methodist Church that they had originally identified as wanting to put these interpretive signs on to give a little bit of information about the history of the building as well as current use. You know, a lot of these buildings have been reused over the years, and so they'd envisioned, so you can see the downtown historic district, which is outlined in red here to the left of your screen, and then this is the new Fort Russell boundary outlined in blue. So they were thinking about creating this nexus between the two and connecting. You know, we have these institutional buildings that intermingle between the district and then are also within the Fort Russell Historic District. And so they'd worked with a consultant to identify kind of the sign face itself. We work with Jenny Kostroff with the 1912 Center as well as Dwight, Parks and Rec and Facilities to identify a key location to plant the sign within the 1912 Center. And the 1912 Center was identified as the first building. Working with Jenny, she was anticipating, you know, towards the end of summer to get this sign installed for some event that they had going on into the fall. And so what we were looking at here was a location in Paul Plaza to install the sign. We had a custom ornamental base that was designed specifically to fit in with the architecture of the buildings. But looking at this location to be installed within the planner, we didn't really need the artistic ornamental base for this spot. So it'd be adjacent to the public sidewalk, so you'd be able to walk up to it and be located approximately within this circular area within the planter bed and up at a 45-degree angle. So you can be walking along the sidewalk and read a little bit of information about the building. This was the 1912 Center sign that we had done quite a bit of work on. So it goes through kind of the progressive era when the building was first constructed and established, a little bit of the architectural and detail design that's contained within the building, and then goes through the adaptive use of the building, turning it into from the high school into a community center and what had occurred there, and includes a number of historical photos, some of those architectural detail photos, and then existing photos of during the transition of the building, as well as some of the uses serving as our community's event center. And this is the single post pedestal, so this is not the ornamental one that we had come up with. Just because it's in that planter base and you can't see it, this is, there's no need for the ornamental base. And so working with sign crafters in Lewiston, they'd identified this pedestal as appropriate and being able to carry our sign face that we're looking at for the 1912 Center. Looking at City Hall would be the kind of the next step of interpretive signs. We'd identified this location on the south side, adjacent to 3rd Street. In the area here, there's going to be a bike shelter, as you're aware of, that's going to be constructed over here in this green space. But engineering through that project is planning on doing some Y-scaping within this area, just like the corner of City Hall. And so we're looking at integrating that sign within that area of City Hall. And this is the sign face. This hasn't, it's almost there. Some of the wording still needs to change, but graphically, the layout's pretty much final. What we're looking at it shows a good transition of the building being constructed. So a lot of times with these older buildings, you can't really find pictures of the building being constructed. And so this is kind of a rarity to find all these historic photos, especially taken from the same angle. So they were able to acquire these through the Historical Society. And then once again, talk about the post office as the initial use, the transition to City Hall, and then just look at all the architectural features and details that are contained within the building. And then they like this postcard that was a historic postcard of the image of the building. This is the ornamental base that the commission had come up with, and it was resembling a lot of the architecture. So you see like these arched windows here. It was kind of forming the base off of a lot of those historical architectural details of these buildings. So it's 24 by 36 for the sign face itself, and then includes the 2 arches for the bases on either side. It's proposed to be powder coated steel, black powder coated. So a little bit about the budget. So in 2018 we had budgeted $2,500 for these signs, and then upcoming fiscal year 2019 budget, we also have another $2,500. And we'd received bids from the sign company. So for the 1912 Center sign, which we plan on installing first, this is a 1/2-inch panel with a single post base. That comes out to be a little over $1,100. City Hall sign, 1/2-inch panel with a custom base is quite a bit more just because of the custom base, and that's a little over $2,100. Library sign, we can order the custom base just because we have enough funds. They require a 50% deposit, so we'd be able to cover that with fiscal year 2018 budget. And then we'd be able to roll that in 2019 and cover the rest of the 2 bases and the 2 panels. Actually 3 bases and 2 panels, excuse me. And so the total of that would be just under $5,000, what we have budgeted for the project. And then in fiscal year 2020, we'd be looking at submitting a budget request in order to close out the project. So we still need to purchase the library sign, just the panel, because we'd purchased the custom base in FY2019. And then the Methodist Church sign. Methodist Church, it's on our logo, not necessarily a city building. And so we're, still discussing whether or not we still need to talk with the church and see how they feel about it. And so it's tentative right now as far as that sign. But right now we're moving forward with 1912 Center, City Hall, and Library, proceeding with those signs at this point. So, and with that, I'd certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have. We're looking for authorization to proceed with ordering and installing the interpretive signs, which have been budgeted for this fiscal year and next fiscal year.
Is what you've shown us, are those the finalized and approved designs?
The 1912 Center is pretty much the finalized design, so we've worked with Jenny. This has probably been through 30 iterations. The City Hall sign is still in draft format, and so Nels Reese of the commission, I think, was supposed to look at some of the wording, and that may change. Most of the design has been done. It's just the wording may change.
Okay. I hate to seem nitpicky, but the font that this was done in is one of two fonts that's sort of universally hated by graphic designers, and I would be great if we could change that
The
to
City
something
Hall?
else. Yeah.
Okay.
That font.
Well, I'd be happy to say that I didn't choose it. I chose the, I did do this one, but yeah, we can take a look at it. I know they were playing around with a couple of different fonts on both of the signs, but we ended up, yeah, I mean, I think the commission didn't necessarily like another font. They looked at this font. But yeah, it's certainly one of the things that was of a point of discussion at the commission meetings was the font. And so I can pass that on and we can take a look at another font.
That would be
Certainly.
great. Other than that, I
Yeah.
think fantastic.
I do agree that it's a tidge difficult to read with all the extra.
Yeah, and it, you know, it all depends, right? So when you print it, sometimes it's darker and it's, you know, maybe harder to read. On the computer, it looks different. And so we'll have to play with that as we go to the sign company just to make sure it's, you know, what happens when they print it on the sign face itself is going to show up and we're going to be able to read it and it's not going to conflict with the background imagery. They did want to highlight, you know, this is the background images of one of the original blueprints of the City Hall building, which those are, you know, historic buildings. Oftentimes they're hard to find as well. So it actually looks really neat, maybe not show up completely in this image, but when you blow it up on the 24 by 36, it's a little bit easier to read and you know, doesn't come through as well and doesn't conflict as much. But yeah, that, you know, this has been a point of discussion on the commission level for quite some time. And so we'll make sure that we get it right and you can read it. It's not going to be a problem.
I appreciate
So,
that.
Do you have any questions, sir?
No questions. I think it's just a nice project to illuminate the history and the uses of the buildings that make Moscow's historic downtown area and extensions what they are today. I think it's a great idea, and I got to commend the Historic Preservation Commission for all the work they've done on this, so good on them.
Indeed.
I'd like to move forward with it.
Okay, so let's recommend authorization for the Historic Preservation Commission to proceed with ordering and installing the interpretive signs, which have been budgeted in 2018 and 2019. Do you want consent on this, or do we want to put it on regular?
I think we consent on this one.
We'll
That works
consent
for
this
me.
one. Okay. All right, Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next item is Moscow School District Agreement for School Resource Officer, Chief Fry. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. So as you have seen, I'm bringing forth a memorandum of understanding between us and the Moscow School District for a second SRO position. And with that, that officer will be placed in the middle school. And then also in the grade schools, we'll divide them out between the two SROs. But we're starting out with a 70% school district payment the first year, 85% the second, and 100% the third. And it'll be a 3-year contract to see how that goes, but then we'll try to extend it beyond that. Currently, they provide $2,000 to the Moscow Police Department, which will go away. We'll supply one of the SROs, and the school district will supply the second.
It's a good partnership, sounds like. Any questions?
Oh, just to clarify, the memorandum of agreement stipulates that the SRO will be at the middle school and elementary school, and so that implies that the other one is at the high school and maybe some elementary school as well. That was a little nebulous.
Yeah, that's
as I read
correct.
through.
We'll have one at the high school and one at the middle school, and they will divide their time with the different elementary schools. So they will be in all the schools around, but their main offices will be in the high school, middle school, and then they will go out throughout the week.
Okay,
Works for me. Sounds like a good partnership.
agreed. All right, we're going to recommend approval of the MOU for the SRO, and 3-letter acronyms are us. And I think this one should go on consent too, as opposed to, although it'd be kind of cool to talk about it though.
It'll be, City Supervisor Reedner will be presenting that if it goes to full council, because I will be with, at the Rodney Atkins concert in the command post for that.
You mean you
night.
have other things to do besides council meetings?
So either way, it doesn't matter, but City Supervisor Reedner
Well,
will
I
cover
think
that.
we can send it because it'll be a busy night, but that's awesome, and we commend this partnership.
And this was also discussed in the FY19 budget request and approval, so.
Remember.
It's been
Okay.
vetted a couple of times.
Awesome. Strong
Thank you.
word. Thank you, sir. Our second to the last item, does that sound right? Yeah. Is the amendment of Title IV, Chapters 4, 7, 8, and 10 of Moscow City Code regarding various zoning code amendments. Hello again, Mike.
Hi,
How are you?
doing well.
Okay, good. Tell us about the changes.
So this is a proposed ordinance that the Planning and Zoning Commission has worked on, and these are 4 relatively minor amendments that they've combined into one ordinance. The first one addresses access to lots and buildings. So right now in the zoning code, we have a requirement that every lot that's created has to abut a public street right away, other than an alley, for a minimum distance of 40 feet with some exceptions. We give exceptions to cul-de-sac lots, flag lots, twin homes, and townhouses, and then lots that are approved prior to the adoption of the lot frontage requirement. And so we have some lots that are just have frontage on alleys, for instance. And so a number of years ago, we added this section to, alleviate some of those issues with some of those non-conforming lots that don't abut a street, but they were created prior to the zoning code being adopted. So those are the primary sections. We're looking at specifically the flag lot exception. Approved flag lots, and so we have, we allow them to go down to at least 20 feet adjacent to the street right away. The portions of the flag lots can't exceed 150 feet in length, and they can't be less than 20 feet in width at any portion of the flag pole lot. Current flag exception doesn't adequately address larger properties in more rural zones, so we're looking at a lot of these properties on the outskirts, still within city limits or could be within the area city impact, that were platted or subdivided at some point in time. And you have a lot of lot sizes like ag forest, farm ranch, suburban residential. I mean, the minimum lot size there is, for suburban residential is 1 acre. Farm ranch is 4 acres. Ag forest is 40 acres. And so you end up with these larger lots, and the flagpole standard doesn't necessarily address or contemplate these larger lots. And so giving an example of more urban flag lots that were developed, and so these are all flag lots. This is classified as our flagpole portion of the flag lot. So you have the 20-foot portion, can't exceed 150 feet in length, and then it ends up opening up into the main portion of the lot, and you're able to develop a house on that portion. So this is really allowed for infill development, urban infill development in town, and so that's really the reason for these flagpole lots. You end up going in some of these rural areas, so this is North Polk Extension, close to the city limits, and a lot of this area up here is in the area of city impact. Well, you have this odd lot configuration that was never necessarily in a subdivision. They just ended up subdividing these lots through maybe a lot division process. And you end up with, this is 150 feet from the road. So you run into the issue of, the flagpole. Well, you have this whole area back here that could, have some infill development, single family. But you can't get past the flagpole requirement of 150 because it runs into a house, and then you don't meet setback requirements. And so it really diminishes the opportunity for a lot of this, kind of attractive infill development in a lot of these rural areas. And so the proposed addition here would add to the exceptions just for these 3 more rural zones: ag forest, farm ranch, suburban residential. Allow access provided by a permanent access easement of no less than 20 feet in width at any point. And then it goes on to define for those zones, the flag poles and access easements can be greater than 150 feet in length, so long as sufficient fire department access is provided. And so I think originally the intention or the reason they ended up with 150 and 20 feet in width is it satisfies fire department access requirements. And so once you go beyond the 150, generally you need a fire truck turnaround to be provided. In those urban lots, you know, they don't have enough room for a fire truck turnaround. But you look at the lots here, I mean, there's plenty of room to have a turnaround somewhere on these properties, so we don't really run into the issue there. But we did want to insert in the language that the fire department still needs to, provide approval of this, even though it's inherent through a development that they would. So that would cover that amendment. We have PUD amendments, and so this is fairly simple. So right now, the PUD code, there are numerous zones that don't have residential base density defined. We're basically inserting base densities for those appropriate zones. And the existing code also doesn't state which zones are eligible for plan unit developments as well. So we'd be inserting a paragraph at the very beginning of the PUD chapter that discusses eligibility. So there's an eligibility section. It goes through all the zones that PUDs are allowed within. And then the commission did want special consideration for neighborhood business zones. And so, they hold neighborhood business in a high regard for providing these commercial pockets and services to the surrounding residential areas and neighborhoods. So they wanted any plan unit development that comes forward in the neighborhood business zone to include a commercial component. And so we've inserted that within that initial entry paragraph for eligibility and put that in there. So questions on that? No? The third amendment is within the Chapter 8 of the Zoning Code, addresses appeals, variances, conditional and special uses, really lays out the process for all these land use actions. You have procedures, you have relevant criteria and standards, you have a requirement that a reason statement be drafted and approved and be in writing, addresses conditions that may be required, no precedent, final decision, compliance, and revocations. First order of business, so with our use table ordinance, we eliminated special uses and pretty much just combined those into conditional uses, and so we didn't have the confusion of having both, even though they were the same criteria. So we need to eliminate the special use section, which we're doing here. And then the revocation sections for variances and conditional uses. We have a portion of that which discusses expiration of approved CUP or variance, and it ties it to the acquisition of a building permit within a year. So if you don't acquire a building permit within a year of receiving approval of the CUP or variance, it's essentially null and void. We've ran into issues over the years with some of these larger institutional projects, schools, churches, public service facilities, some multifamily, so you get a CU for a ground floor multifamily in some zones. They've ran into some challenges for meeting that year time frame, because if you think about it, a lot of the substantial investment in some of these larger projects occurs after they receive approval. And so you have construction plans in greater detail, you've got fundraising, property acquisition often happens after the project's received approval, and so a lot of times a year can just fly by and really become a kind of a tight time frame. So the commission, through the process of this, ended up researching some other jurisdictions in Idaho, Boise, Coeur d'Alene, Meridian, Lewiston, to name a few. Most of these other jurisdictions had a 2-year expiration period, and there was also ability to administratively extend the approval period by another year, and so another 2 years, excuse me. So the initial period was 2 years, and then it was administrative. You have to submit a request to extend it from the applicant, and staff was able to do that for another 2 years, ultimately 4 years. And so the commission reviewed this, determined that it was reasonable to have the 2-year time frame for the initial period, and then reasonable to allow the extension of another 2 years by the zoning administrator. And then they also wanted the ability to extend that kind of initial 2-year and the extension period through the Board of Adjustment. And so that's the decision-making body. They wanted the ability to go, have them go back to the Board of Adjustment and have it reviewed. And it would not be a public hearing. They would be able to extend that period unless there's some things that have changed since the initial approval.
Anne had a question.
Yeah, currently it's 1 year, right, for the extension?
We currently don't have an extension.
Oh,
It pretty
okay.
much just expires after a year, and there's no
Gotcha.
opportunity for an extension.
Okay.
So we'd be inserting, amending the initial approval period to 2 years from 1 year, and then we'd be inserting another section which addresses an extension allowance. So the first extension would be staff, and you'd be able to extend it by 2 years. And then the second extension, after that 4-year time, they'd be able to request another extension for the Board of Adjustment. And it would just be a regular agenda item at a regular meeting. And they would review it, and they would, in certain circumstances, they would require it to go all the way back through the process if there are a number of things that it met. So we're looking at whether there have been significant amendments to the comp plan or the zoning ordinance, which will affect the conditional use permit. So maybe we want to, go back and go through the whole process again. Whether or not there's been significant land use changes in the vicinity which would adversely impact the project or adversely be impacted by the project. And then whether community facilities and services remain adequate to serve the project. And so a lot of times, these are the issues that you're concerned about whenever you have a piece of property that's sat, been approved for a conditional use permit but sat vacant for that amount of time, is maybe these things change and it's not appropriate anymore in that location because of changing land uses or comp plan or zoning code. It's much more prevalent in a lot faster growing communities, like if you're looking at Kootenai County area, down in Boise, Meridian area, which have, just really high growth rates. Our relatively linear growth rate, things don't change that much in that amount of time. And so, but we want the assurances in place that if they do, it goes back through a public hearing. And so we've crafted it that way.
Yeah.
And then the fourth amendment would be public hearing notice requirements. So essentially all these land use actions, annexation, comp plan, land use designation amendment, rezone, preliminary plat, and PUD, they all go through the same public hearing process. And it starts with a neighborhood meeting. This notifies all property owners within 600 feet, provides 14 days notice. And this is something that we go above and beyond state code requirements. So we're not required to conduct a neighborhood meeting. It's worked well in our estimation over the years just because it provides an opportunity for the developer to meet with any public, that may be interested in the project and answer questions face to face instead of, trying to get those questions answered at a public hearing. And so it's, I think it's been a good thing for us to conduct this neighborhood meeting, even though it's not required. And then we have a public hearing before planning and zoning. So once you conduct the neighborhood meeting, you take inventory of everybody that has, attendance sheet, you take minutes, and then you submit those materials along with the application to our office. We schedule it for a public hearing before planning and zoning. Once again, we notify everybody within 600 feet. We provide 30-day notice for this with posted 7 days in advance of the meeting on site. 30-day notice is double what state code requires, so state code just requires 15-day notice. And then from there, P&Z makes a recommendation to council, and there's another public hearing at the council level. Once again, we notify everybody within 600 feet. There's 15 days notice, and then it's also posted on site 7 days in advance of the meeting. Just 15 days notice in this occurrence, which is consistent with state code requirements. And the whole process usually takes about 4 months. So, you're in each of these actions, you go back and have to approve relevant criteria and standards most of the time. And so that'll happen at a subsequent meeting. And then once you've approved that, then you typically notice, for the next level of review. And so all in all, it ends up being about 4 months, depending upon meeting schedules and then, the RCS approval and all that. So, what we've been discussing, or what the proposal is to reduce the 15-day or the 30-day notice to 15 days. In the past, you know, it's just kind of drawn on the public hearing process, and it almost acts in the reverse of what you're looking for, just because, you know, 30 days is so far out that I think a lot of people end up forgetting that it's coming up just because of the time frame. And so, you know, the commission discussing this hadn't really identified an advantage to leaving it as 30 days and thought it'd be more expedient, and with the whole process taking 4 months already and the 3 levels of review, and, you know, maybe you're out of town for a couple weeks, but you still have, you know, 2 more meetings that you're able to attend and voice your concern and submit input for. They thought it was appropriate that we could reduce it to 15 days notice instead of the current 30 days notice. And so that would be the only change at the Planning and Zoning Commission level. It'd be reduced to 15 days from the current 30 days notice. And so we'd be amending actually the portion that talks about neighborhood meeting at the end. That's where it talks about the 30-day notice, and we'd just be striking 30 and inserting 15 days within that section. So that's essentially all the proposals, so 4 of them, and we have this scheduled for public hearing at the council's next meeting on Monday, August 20th. So,
I know you had some questions.
Yes.
Yes, you did.
Relative to the CUP issue, have we ever had any projects that have dragged on for more than 6 years with a CUP? Because you have your initial 2 years, potential for another 2 years, then Board of Adjustment.
well, I think the ice rink is probably the longest lasting that I'm aware of, which hasn't started, you know, I mean, still hasn't started yet, but they having to come back and reapply and reapply. There's a number of projects out there that just never started. So there was, you know, remember there was a church on White Avenue that ended up,
It's a
you know,
big blank lot, even.
yeah, and right now it's still a vacant lot. You know, there's been, you know, that's kind of a good example of changing conditions. I mean, it's always been zoned R4 ever since the CUP was approved, but, you know, in that time, apartments have grown around that property, and so it may be a little bit different, and maybe that's something that, you know, of course, the time frame's passed by now, but maybe that's something that would warrant, you know, the board to conduct another public hearing. And so, yeah, I mean, we've got a handful of these projects that, you know, go and get approval and then just never get off the ground, or ones that, you know,
Yeah,
get
because I
tied
wonder
up in
sometimes is
fundraising.
it wise just to let the thing die and just go away? Because 6 years seems really long.
Well, I mean, if they still think it's viable,
At the end of
then they
year
would,
4.
yeah, I mean, then if they didn't think it was viable, then they would just not request an extension and it'd become null and void. So even after the 2-year time frame, you know, it's not like we just automatically approve
Right,
them. They have to
apply for it.
request it, you know, we would have to notify them that the 2 years was coming up, and they'd have to request from our office that be extended.
So it seems like pretty special circumstances, so I don't see it happening very often, such things. And also, when would this take effect? Would this affect current CUPs or just CUPs coming forth in the future?
Well, that would, I would anticipate that it would affect current CUPs,
So they would be,
as long as they didn't expire prior to the ordinance being approved,
yeah,
if it was
so-
to be approved.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of, so something that's coming up, if this ordinance were to pass, then a current CUP getting towards the end of its lifespan could apply for an administrative relief for another 2 years.
Correct.
Right.
Okay. And also, on the other issue of the 15-day notice that's proposed, I think it's worth pointing out that even if it's a 15-day notice published in the paper, for planning and zoning, that usually means more like 19 days, because you have 2 weeks to get to the 15 days, and then it lapses over to a Wednesday meeting, so it's actually even longer in practice.
Yeah, and we always send it out, I mean, even the 30 days, it has to go to the paper and publish on a Saturday, and so that accounts for the 30 days. And we always send out, you know, usually when we send it to the paper the previous Wednesday, we usually send out the mailings to all the 600
Yep.
people.
So in practice, it's longer than 15.
Correct.
in
correct,
reality, yeah.
correct.
So P&Z, I think, has done another good job of cleaning up some loose ends. Done a good job with that.
Yeah.
So I like it.
Do you have any questions?
No, just thank you to you and Victoria and all the other commissioners for all the thoughtful effort that went into it. Thank you.
So regarding the CUP aging revocation moment, will you reach out to existing CUPs that maybe don't understand they are now under a new rule? Or will you let them figure that out?
Well, I mean, we have so few that we would reach out to them, but there's
Okay.
none that are, active right now that I'm
ticking.
aware of. All the ones that have been approved recently have all received building permits. And so,
Okay.
and, have been, started that process. And
Projects
so
are
they're
moving.
vested.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. I do like the structure, I really do, and I think it's smart move. So I think we ought to forward this item for public hearing on the proposed ordinance at the council's August 20th meeting. Good suggestion. Thank you very much for all your work.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, Vandaltown Block Party Resolutions, Jen Peffner.
Good afternoon. So we
Hello there.
have coming up, fall is upon us, students are returning. The Vandaltown Block Party is scheduled for September 7th. This is the 2018 version. I think it is the 4th annual event that we've had. If you remember previous events, we typically close Main Street. We have many community members participate, and we're looking to grow that again this year. We do 2 bands typically, sometimes 3. And then we also invite our beer and wine vendors to host a beer or wine garden within Main Street as allowable by state and city ordinance. However, we need a resolution to allow us to do that. So we actually have 2 resolutions for your consideration for recommendation for approval. The first would be that beer and wine garden resolution and the closure of with the closure of Main Street. The second would be to allow those businesses who have sidewalk cafes to extend their sidewalk cafes, providing more room to serve both food and beer and wine in those areas, per the statutes that we have in place. And so, 2 resolutions for your consideration to forward on to council today.
Having been on the organizing end of 3 out of the 4 of these with you, Jen, I think it is a very positive moment for the businesses. They do have a good evening business, and it is a nice chance to get some of the non-Main Street businesses some exposure as well. So,
And it's been good for the city at large, as well as the
and
citizens.
it's good. Yep, we give a good block party. I will say that. Do either of you have any questions?
I have no questions or issues with it. I'd like to see it go forward with enthusiasm.
Okay, so
Thank you.
we want that in the
With
verbiage.
enthusiasm.
We enthusiastically recommend approval of both of those ordinance, or resolutions. Those are great.
Would you like that on the consent agenda?
Yes.
Okay. Also, if I could just real quick, thank you to the Chamber of Commerce and then the University of Idaho who partner with us on this. They help this event tremendously be
Indeed.
the success that it's grown to. So we really appreciate their help.
Awesome. Okay, that's the end of our regular agenda. We do have a report here for animals in the market implementation report.
Right, and I'm also going to have Amanda Argona, our community events manager, join us. I'll pull up a quick PowerPoint real quick and we'll.
Okay. Okay. Hi, Miss Amanda.
Just checking.
I'll just give a quick bit of history and then I'll let Amanda speak to what's actually happening on the ground. So in 2012, we passed a resolution, the council passed a resolution limiting dogs and animals to the eastern sidewalk of the market. This was just as we were looking at Main Street and the market on Main Street. Since that time, we've had ADA service animals have always been allowed in the market. That original resolution provided for access to Main Street, which, as we note at the bottom, that's one of the reasons we discussed it at that time, because it is a public right-of-way. We need to provide some sort of access for people who may not be attending the market to get across Main Street or get through Main Street from one end to the other. So we did notice in 2017 we had a lot of dogs in the market. About 12 to 15 was the average that we were seeing. So we tried the Midas the Guide Dog campaign to talk about guide dogs, ADA dogs, that they were allowed in the market. All others needed to maintain or stay on the eastern sidewalk there. And then in 2018, we realized it's discussing with dog owners that they could only be on one side of the street and not the other is rather cumbersome, especially when you're dealing with a lot of other patrons in the market, some of those other things that are going on market day. And so asked the council to approve allowing dogs on both sides of the sidewalk, both the east and west sidewalks. Again, the goal there was to provide easier messaging for animals in the market. And just as I mentioned, a note, providing that access to Main Street, whether someone's there for the market or not, was kind of in the back of our minds all along, knowing that we want to maintain that for that public right-of-way space there. So I'll let maybe Amanda talk about recent experience since the resolution change and what we've done for signage and those types of things.
Yeah, so this is an issue not new to me. I had to do it when I was an AmeriCorps member. Not much has changed, it seems like to me. But folks, generally speaking, are more than willing to be relocated to either side of the sidewalk. It's actually easier where you can just say this instead of this. And then, of course, there's still the public education aspect where people will still see dogs at the market. They're obviously allowed to use the market thoroughfare to get from sidewalk to sidewalk. So there's still that piece. But I think staff has done a really good job. I think this year, since we started keeping track when I took on the transition as a full-time community events manager, we're averaging about 13 dogs that we need to, per market day. And we also started including not just the dogs that had to be redirected, but anyone that we had to approach with the dog. So that could be that we approached someone and we just asked if they were an ADA service dog or not. So we've been tracking that like collectively. There's still a lot of education, even amongst folks that do have ADA service dogs, using the correct language, working within the best of our legal realm to make sure that, we're not isolating anyone. And I think the biggest issue that we come up against is small dogs. People being able to put their dogs in a backpack or carry them. We've had a lot of vendor feedback who, there's a lot of vendors who enjoy dogs at the market, but with the hot temperatures, there's a concern about paws on the pavement. We were able to have code enforcement in the market one day. That particular day, we had a really high number, and it could be that we weren't communicating with code enforcement to get a description of the dog. Staff generally, if we do talk with someone, will radio to everyone, like, I talked with this dog owner, this description, it's okay to go. So we don't have to harass any people that do have legit ADA service dogs. We, however, can't remember everyone that we talked to, and I know we've had some incidents where we've asked the same person, different staff members each week, and so remembering who is a regular market patron that has an ADA service dog can be a bit difficult sometimes. So we had one incident where someone threatened to call the cops on us because they felt like they were being targeted, and so it's just more education, and we approach it really calmly. We have little flyer pamphlets that we give out to folks if they have further questions that cite the city code. And then I think Jen has included some graphic updates. Where do I point this at?
You can just hit the right arrow.
Okay.
There you go. So this was the signage we had last year saying ADA service dogs are welcome. Please, if you're not an ADA service animal, please move to the eastern sidewalk. Just a lot of words on the page. And of course, this is a 24 by 36 sign.
Yeah.
So what we were able to do with the new resolution that was put in place, if you want to just go one more, just simplified things, simplified signage. One of the things that we'll be bringing more information on is the market's currently in the process of doing an updated rapid market assessment. One of the big pieces of the rapid market assessment is tracking not only customer spending habits, why they're at the market, where they're coming from, but it's also doing a count of patrons at the market. Mm-hmm. So we're finding our counts are higher than we maybe anticipated, and so we're also seeing a lot more out-of-area folks coming in, so that education piece Amanda speaks to is pretty critical every single weekend, weekend in and weekend out. It's a different group of folks we're seeing. So being able to do some of these types of things and then really working to help people see the signs, to read the signs, which is sometimes tricky. It's definitely helped us in this vein too. So we'll have more information on what market patrons look like and all that fun stuff as we move forward as well.
And I think the biggest thing we come up against in the summertime is there's a huge like national campaign out there to not leave your dogs in a hot car. So if you're visiting, you're out of town, you have your dog with you, you don't want to leave your dog in the vehicle and, you know, have it overheat, so you bring it to the market and they just aren't aware, so.
Questions?
I'm just thinking about, I mean, how you would prevent asking the same folks over and over unless you have the same staff members there every time.
Yeah, we do tend to have the same staff members there every time, and there are some folks who like just really stick out in your brain, and it just could be that we're missing one or two. There's only been that one incident that has been kind of an issue, and we're still learning what is sort of an allowable disability to have an ADA service dog. So that's an education piece that staff is still working on as well. Anxiety doesn't really count, but PTSD does. So there's some gray areas that we're still working with.
So being the only council member who doesn't think this is a good idea, I have a couple issues. Yes, it is a public right-of-way. It is not or should not be, safety should not be compromised in this process. I do also hear what I think are a series of training issues that need to be addressed that, you know, I hope we're not putting ourselves in the position of deciding what disability is allowable.
Nope.
No,
ma'am.
No.
Okay, because we're not those people.
No, and the resources we're using are just the questions that we're allowed to ask is, do you have a disability that requires you to have this animal? They can say yes or no. They don't have to share that disability with us. And then we ask them, what service does your animal perform? Some people voluntarily give that information up. And according to the ADA National Network that we reference, there are some things that they've outlined in there. But we don't usually fight anything like that. But if someone says an emotional support animal or a therapy dog, those animals do not qualify under the ADA service dog definition.
And what do we do at that point?
We let them know that under, was it Title 4 or 3, that they do not qualify as an ADA service dog and that they're more than welcome to still be in the market on the sidewalks. But, you know, if people get hostile, there's always, we can call the cops, but we try not to get people riled up to that point. And there's only so much, there's only so much that we can do. And you know how, the market is a very big area and staff regularly will try and make it a point to be like, oh, I'm going to just like go take a walk and check things. So if we see someone and we approach them and let them know and we see them exit off to the sidewalk, but later on they just decide to come back in because they're, I just want to grab this one thing and move to the sidewalk again. But I haven't had too many instances.
Are we tracking these incidents? So at the end of the year, when we council say, okay, how many unsafe moments did we have with animals and how many moments did we have where we're...
I haven't had any unsafe moments. I haven't yet. I definitely have had some health moments where, like health concerns, like I had a blueberry vendor who said, a small animal that was being carried sneezed on her product, you know, and that happened last week too, where a friend approached me and said, like, we just were catching up, and she goes, by the way, there's a dog behind you, and it just like sneezed on those tomatoes. So there is some health concern too.
Are we tracking those?
I can track those. I can begin to track those, but as far as like dog incidents, right now it's just market staff approaching the dog owners to say, you need to be relocated to the sidewalk. We did have one poop incident already. That was a weekend that I was gone, and I did.
We're tracking the major incidents as they come up.
Good.
For instance, I don't think we've had any leash issues. I know that's one of the concerns that council mentioned when we talked about moving to both sidewalks.
Right.
Tripping hazards, those type of things.
Yeah,
So,
I haven't had any biting incidents. Like, if those are happening, no one is reporting that to market staff.
No.
Okay. I just, that was my biggest stumbling block and why I voted against the whole idea, was that I am not convinced safety is entirely addressed in this situation. And knowing that some big labradoodle sneezed all over my blueberries adds to the joy.
Yeah.
So I would like us to be as comprehensive as we can with these kind of things that are occurring, so that at the end of the year, when we are looking at this again, we can make an informed decision and not just a 1 or 2 or 3 issue. I want us to be able to look at the whole.
And
the
Gina,
whole
were you
situation.
just not in favor of having dogs on the market at all? Was that, I don't know your stance. That,
You know, I'm not, because I think it's a serious safety hazard, and we have a broad definition of public.
Right.
Little kids, older people that aren't sound on their feet, that sort of thing. And my dogs can be lovely. I love them. I love to have them in the car with me and go on rides and stuff. But the minute, I'm not expecting them to act like little insane animals. They do.
Yeah.
So, you know, everybody loves their dogs the same way I do. And this, it's just, to me, it's just too many unknowns.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, and if I may, the conversation we had when we were in the Jackson Street parking lot, frankly, was an easier conversation because we weren't limiting access at any point. The Main Street conversation does make it a little bit more difficult, but I think by tracking those additional things, we can provide the information to let council make their decisions.
Okay.
Absolutely.
awesome. Thank you, and welcome as well. I've always been a fan, so we definitely chose the right one. All right, do you guys have anything else?
Nada.
You're good? You want to adjourn?
Let's
Okay, good. So moved.